The Arizona sky turned dark as lead, and the rain came hard, washing over the dying earth in desperate sheets. Eliza Hammond pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and pushed her way through the mud, her boots sinking deep with every step. Her fields, once golden with wheat, were now a ruin of flattened stalks and rushing water. She grabbed at the wooden fence to keep it from collapsing, her hands raw from work and cold. She'd built this farm with her late husband, Thomas, but since his death 3 years ago, every storm seemed to take another piece of him away. Thunder rolled across the plain and the world seemed to shake. That's when she saw him. He stood on the ridge beyond her barn, tall and motionless, the rain cutting down over his bare shoulders. Even through the downpour, she could see he was Apache. Dark braids tied back, chest marked with old scars, eyes sharp as a hawk's. For a breath, she froze. No one came this far out unless they wanted trouble. And yet he didn't move toward her, didn't threaten, just watched. Her heart pounded as she shouted over the wind, "You'd best get out of the rain. There's nothing here for you." The stranger didn't reply. He only turned his head slightly, watching the fence as it groaned and began to tip. Before she could react, he was moving, fast, silent, his boots splashing through the water. With one hand, he caught the collapsing fence post and heaved it upright, his muscles flexing under the strain. Eliza stared, startled by his strength. Together, without a word, they pushed the heavy wood back into place and secured it with rope from the barn wall. When the worst of the storm passed, she leaned against the fence, breathing hard. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "This isn't your fight." The man stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his expression unreadable. After a long silence, he spoke in a low, rough voice that seemed unused to words. "You fight the storm alone." Eliza blinked, unsure if it was a question or a statement. "There's no one left to fight it with me," she said quietly. He nodded once, like he understood. Then, before she could ask his name, he turned and started to walk away into the sheets of rain. "Wait," she called. "At least get out of the cold." He stopped but didn't turn around. For a moment she thought he might ignore her completely. Then slowly he looked back, eyes dark as the thunderclouds above. Something in them wasn't wild or cruel. It was tired, broken. Inside the barn, she built a small fire from dry hay and kindling, the air filling with smoke and warmth. The Apache sat near the door, close enough to leave if he needed to. He didn't remove the long knife strapped to his belt. Eliza noticed that and kept her distance, wrapping herself in a blanket. After a while, she asked softly, "What's your name?" He hesitated. Tan, she repeated. "I'm Eliza Hammond." He gave no reaction. But when she passed him a piece of cornbread she'd saved from supper, he accepted it with quiet respect. For several minutes, neither spoke. The rain hammered on the roof and the air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. When the wind outside eased, Tan rose and moved toward the door. "You shouldn't be out there," Eliza said. "The river's rising." "I know where to walk," he replied. He turned again to leave, but before disappearing into the rain, he said softly, almost to himself, "Your hands are brave, but they shake." Eliza stood there long after he was gone, the sound of his voice lingering like the echo of thunder. She didn't know why it mattered, but it did. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone in her fight against the world. Out beyond the ridge, the Lone Apache walked into the storm, his figure swallowed by the rain. But the memory of his eyes, deep with pain and mystery, stayed with her long after the night grew quiet. And in that silence, Eliza Hammond felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she thought had died with her husband, a spark, a beginning. The storm passed, but it left behind a ruin that nearly broke Eliza's spirit. Her fences were down again. Her roof leaked in 2 places and half her crops had drowned under the rushing water. She spent the next morning knee-deep in mud, her skirts soaked, patching what she could with rope and stubbornness. Her body ached, but the ache in her heart ran deeper. She could almost hear her late husband's voice scolding her for working alone again. When she went into town 2 days later, the air turned cold around her the moment she stepped through the general store's door. The men standing near the counter fell silent, their eyes sliding over her like knives. Sheriff McKean, broad-shouldered, red-faced, and still wearing the same smug grin he'd had when Thomas's coffin was lowered, was leaning by the stove. "Eliza Hammond," he drawled, pretending to tip his hat. "Heard the storm near took your farm again? Maybe it's time you admit you can't keep it alone." "I'll manage," she said stiffly, setting her few coins on the counter. He smirked. You know the law. A woman can't hold a deed without a husband's signature. You've had grace these past years because the council took pity, but they're tired of pity. You need a husband or someone else will be signing that paper for you. The words hit her harder than the storm had. She stood there frozen as the men laughed quietly among themselves. When she left, her hands were shaking. That night, Eliza sat by her fire staring at the flickering shadows. The truth was she had no one. Her neighbors had turned their backs on her for refusing McKean's proposal years ago, and the men in town saw her as nothing more than a burden to be pitied or conquered. Her only company now was the sound of the wind through broken boards. Then she saw him again. Ta'an stood by the barn, his face half lit by the moon, a rope slung over his shoulder. He was repairing the fence, the same one they had struggled with during the storm. She stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly. You came back, she said softly. He didn't look up. Fence still weak, he murmured. I fix, she swallowed hard. You don't owe me that. His dark eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. You helped me when others would not. For a long moment they just stood there in the quiet night, two lonely souls bound by circumstance more than choice. Then Eliza spoke the words before fear could stop her. Ta'an, she whispered, I need help. I can't keep this land without a husband. He stopped, his broad shoulders stiffening. The silence between them thickened. I'm not asking for love or promise, she said quickly. Just to stand by my side long enough for them to see I'm not alone. You could stay here, have food, shelter. No one will bother you. He turned his head, his gaze piercing. And what do you offer a man who is not wanted anywhere? Eliza's throat tightened. A home, even if it's only for a little while. He studied her face, searching for deceit, but found only sincerity and exhaustion. Finally, he stepped closer. The air between them seemed to hum. You need a husband, he said quietly. Then after a pause that felt endless, he added, I need to be loved again. The words hit her like a heartbeat in the dark. She didn't answer at first. She couldn't. The pain in his voice was too real, too raw. At last she said softly, Then maybe we can help each other. He nodded once. Tomorrow, at dawn. And just like that he turned away, vanishing into the shadows beyond the barn. Eliza stood alone under the pale light, her heart racing with something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not hope, but the strange, dangerous beginning of both. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice again. I need to be loved again. And for the first time since her husband's death, she whispered to the empty room, So do I. The dawn broke soft and cold over the Hammond farm. Mist clung to the fields like a thin veil, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Eliza rose early, her heart hammering in her chest as she braided her hair with trembling hands. She dressed in her plainest blue dress, the one she had worn to her husband's funeral. It felt wrong somehow, yet right. There was no silk or lace left in her life, only duty, and the raw hope of survival. When she stepped outside, Ta'an was already waiting near the barn. He stood tall, dressed in worn buckskin trousers and a rough wool shirt someone had likely traded to him years ago. His dark hair gleamed damp from the morning dew, his face calm but unreadable. In his hands he held something, two small carved figures of wood. He offered them to her wordlessly. What are these? She asked, her voice uncertain. Spirit tokens, he said simply. One for you, one for me. So the wind remembers. Eliza held the small carving in her palm. It was of a bird with its wings spread wide. Thank you, she said softly, touched by the quiet meaning. The preacher arrived a little after sunrise, his buggy rattling nervously down the muddy path. Reverend Clark was a small man with a big fear of scandal. His eyes darted between them and his hands trembled as he opened his Bible. Mrs. Hammond, he said carefully, you're certain about this? You understand who this man is? I do, Eliza replied, and I'm asking you to marry us, Reverend, before the town can take what's mine. The preacher hesitated, then glanced toward Ta'an. The Apache met his stare without flinching, silent and steady as stone. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like surrender, the Reverend began the ceremony. The words were simple, so simple that Eliza barely heard them. Her pulse roared in her ears as she repeated the vows. to stand together, to share bread, to guard and protect. She had spoken vows once before in that same tone of hope and trembling. Now they felt heavier, truer. When the preacher told Tayan to take her hand, his touch was warm, strong, and careful, as though he feared she might break. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, a quiet promise in that single gesture. "You may seal your vow," Reverend Clark muttered uneasily, glancing away. Ta'an didn't kiss her. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, his forehead brushing hers. The gesture was ancient, sacred in its simplicity. When it was done, the preacher closed his Bible and cleared his throat. "I'll file the papers in town," he said quickly. "May the Lord be with you both." And with that, he climbed into his buggy and was gone. Eliza and Ta'an stood in silence, watching the wheels fade down the dirt road. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the wheat stubble, whispering through the quiet morning. Finally, Eliza said, "I suppose that makes it official." Ta'an nodded. "It makes it beginning." They spent the rest of the day working side by side. Ta'an repaired the roof while Eliza cooked stew inside. When she brought him a bowl at midday, he took it with a grateful nod. "You work hard," he said simply. "I have to," she replied. "No one else will do it for me." He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Now, someone will." Her cheeks warmed. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the dishes. But his quiet words lingered. That night, Ta'an spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth instead of the spare room. Eliza frowned, confused. "You don't have to sleep there," she said softly. He shook his head. "Until you wish it, I stay where I belong." The firelight flickered across his face, painting it in shades of gold and shadow. Eliza watched him for a long time, wondering what kind of man gave without asking for anything in return. Outside, the coyotes called to each other across the valley, and inside, Eliza Hammond, the widow who had sworn never to love again, lay awake, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her husband's breathing by the fire. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of loss. She dreamed of safety, and for the first time, she began to wonder what it might mean to truly belong to someone again. It didn't take long for the town to find out. By the second week after the wedding, whispers began circling through the dusty streets of Dry Creek like rattlesnakes in tall grass. "The Hammond widow married a savage," someone said at the mercantile. "Must have lost her mind," another hissed at church. No one spoke it to Eliza's face, not yet, but she could feel the change every time she came to town. Doors that once opened politely now shut before she reached them. Men who used to tip their hats turned away. Even the preacher wouldn't meet her eyes on Sunday morning. She tried to ignore it, keeping her chin high as she traded eggs and milk for supplies. But it burned inside her, every whisper, every sideways glance. Then came Sheriff McKean. She found him waiting by her wagon one hot afternoon, boots planted wide, thumbs hooked in his belt like he owned the world. His smirk hadn't changed. "Mrs. Hammond," he said, stressing the name like it was a joke. "Heard some interesting talk around town. You went and married that Apache after all." Eliza gripped the edge of her basket tighter. "You heard right." McKean spat in the dirt. "You'd do better to fix that mistake before folks decide they don't want you here anymore." "I'm not breaking my vows," she said firmly. His eyes narrowed. "You think you can defy the town, Eliza? Live out there with that?" He stopped himself, but the hatred in his tone was clear. "He don't belong here. You don't either if you're choosing him." Before she could speak, a shadow moved silently behind her. "Ta'an." He had appeared without a sound, his tall frame suddenly filling the space beside her. His expression was calm, but his presence alone was enough to make McKean step back half a pace. "Go home," McKean growled. "Before someone makes you." Ta'an's voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "This is her home. You leave her be." The sheriff laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "She don't need you to fight her battles, Injun. Go crawl back to whatever hole you came from." Eliza's heart thudded. She saw the danger in Ta'an's eyes, the controlled fury of a man who had faced worse and lost everything once already. He didn't move, not yet, but when McKean took a step closer to her, the Apache's hand shot out, catching the sheriff's arm with lightning speed. In one motion, he twisted it behind McKean's back until the lawman gasped in pain. "You will not touch her," Ta'an said lowly. "Ta'an, let him go," Eliza cried, grabbing his sleeve. After a tense pause, Ta'an released him. McKean stumbled back, red-faced and humiliated. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Both of you." He stormed off toward town, his boots throwing up dust. Eliza stood frozen, staring after him. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "He raised hand to you," Tan said simply. "I stop it," she sighed. "You've just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in Dry Creek." His dark eyes softened, and he said, "I have many enemies, but I will not let one more hurt what is mine to protect." The words hit her harder than she expected. Mine to protect. He didn't mean it as ownership. It was something older, something deeper. That night she barely spoke as they sat by the fire. Outside, the coyotes' cries seemed closer than usual, the wind colder. Eliza tried to busy herself with mending, but her hands shook. "They'll come again," she murmured. "They won't stop," Ta'an nodded slowly. "Then I stay close. I fix walls. I make ready." "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," she said softly. He looked up, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You are my wife. Your battle is mine." For a long moment the fire crackled between them. Something in his tone melted the wall she'd built around her heart. She turned her face away, afraid of what her eyes might reveal. Outside, the desert night stretched wide and silent, but inside, two lonely hearts, one broken by death, the other by war, had found something fierce enough to face the hatred of a whole town. And though Eliza would not admit it yet, part of her was no longer afraid, because when Ta'an had said, "Your battle is mine," she believed him. The nights grew quieter after the confrontation with Sheriff McKean, but not safer. Eliza knew hatred rarely burned out. It only smoldered, waiting for the right wind. Still, she found herself clinging to the smallest fragments of peace. Ta'an worked from dawn till dusk, rebuilding the barn walls, sharpening tools, repairing fences that had long been left half-broken. He moved with silent purpose, steady and strong, never asking for more than a warm meal and a place to sleep. Yet there was something distant about him, an ache behind his calm, a silence that even the crackling fire couldn't fill. Eliza noticed it most when he sat outside at night, staring into the horizon where the mountains rose like shadows against the stars. Sometimes she would see his lips move softly, as if speaking to someone only he could hear. One evening, unable to bear the quiet curiosity any longer, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "You talk to the sky," she said gently. "Who's listening?" Ta'an didn't turn. "My wife," he answered, voice low, almost carried away by the wind. "And my little boy." Eliza froze. He finally looked at her, eyes dark with something bottomless. "They are gone," he continued. "Soldiers came to my village. They said they hunt raiders, but they shot women. Burned homes. I came back from hunting and found only ashes." The world seemed to stop. Eliza felt her throat tighten, her breath catching in the cool desert air. She wanted to speak, but no words came. He looked down at his hands. "I buried them with my own hands. Then I walked. For years I walked. My people called me dead already. I let them." Eliza stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And now?" "Now," he said, his gaze meeting hers again. "You speak to me, and I remember I am still a man." The confession was quiet, but it filled the space between them with an unbearable tenderness. Eliza sat beside him on the porch, her hand brushing his for the first time, not in fear, not in obligation, but in shared grief. "I lost someone too," she whispered. "Thomas, my husband, was shot when bandits raided the farm. I thought I'd die right beside him." Ta'an nodded, his jaw tight. "And you lived. You built again." "I tried," she said. "But sometimes living feels worse than dying, doesn't it?" He turned toward her, his expression softening. "Only until someone sees you again." The words stole her breath. She didn't look away. The firelight from inside the house caught the edges of his face, the strength, the scars, the quiet sorrow. For a long time, neither moved. Then he spoke again, his voice lower. "When I saw you fighting the storm that night, you looked like someone who would not let death win." Her eyes stung. "And you looked like someone who already had." He gave a faint smile, sad but real. "Maybe now we both can stop fighting alone." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full of something fragile and alive. Eliza leaned back, staring at the stars, her hand still resting against his. She didn't pull it away. "You miss them," she said softly. "Every day," he answered. "But I think..." They would not want me to walk alone forever. That night, she dreamed again, not of her dead husband, not of the fire that took everything, but of two spirits walking side by side through an endless plain, finding warmth in each other's shadows. When she woke, dawn was breaking. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, but Ta'an was still there, sitting near it, his head bowed. The small wooden carving of a bird, the one he'd given her, resting in his hands. He looked up as she stirred, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You slept," he said. She smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he nodded once. "Then maybe your ghosts rest too." Eliza wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that grief could fade, that the ache inside them both could become something gentler, something like love. And as the morning light spilled across the floor, she realized that the past didn't have to vanish for healing to begin. Sometimes it just needed a witness, and Ta'an had finally found his. The days after Ta'an's confession felt quieter, too quiet, like the hush before a storm. Eliza and Ta'an moved through their routines almost peacefully, fixing, planting, tending. She had begun to smile again, though she didn't realize it. Ta'an noticed, though. He saw it in the way she hummed while hanging laundry, in how her hands no longer shook when she poured him coffee. But trouble was coming. Sheriff McKean's pride had been wounded badly that day in town, and there wasn't a man in Dry Creek who didn't hear about how the savage broke his arm in front of the widow. Men like McKean didn't forgive. They waited. One afternoon, when Eliza went into town alone for salt and flour, the murmurs stopped the moment she stepped into the general store. McKean was there, standing by the counter with three other men, Ryder, old Bart Jenkins, and young Earl with the twitchy hands. They fell silent, and she knew something was wrong. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hammond," McKean said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How's that husband of yours? Still playing farmer?" She ignored him and paid for her supplies, but as she turned to leave, his voice followed her. "Funny thing. Someone's horses got stolen last week near the reservation. Apache tracks." She froze. "He didn't steal anything." "Maybe not," McKean said. "But some folks are tired of wondering what he's doing out there on that farm. Could be you're helping him." Her hands trembled. "You leave us alone, Sheriff. We haven't broken any law." He stepped closer, close enough for her to smell whiskey on his breath. "Law's what I say it is in this town, Eliza, and I say that man of yours is trouble." Her heart hammered, but she didn't let him see her fear. "You're the only trouble around here, McKean." For a moment, the mask slipped from his face. The smile faded, and what replaced it was pure hatred. "You'll regret saying that." When she rode home, the wind felt heavy, the air thick with unease. She found Ta'an in the field, working with his shirt off, sweat glistening on his skin. He looked up the moment he saw her face. "What happened?" "They're coming," she said, breathless. "McKean's gathering men. He's blaming you for a theft." Ta'an's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. "Then I will not run. If I run, they say I am guilty. Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking. He looked at the mountains in the distance, their peaks dark against the falling sun. "We wait, and we protect what is ours." That night the moon rose pale and cold. Eliza barely slept. Every creak of the windmill, every rustle outside made her jump. Ta'an stayed awake by the fire, his rifle across his knees. When dawn finally touched the horizon, they both knew today was the day. The first shout came from outside. "Come out, Apache." Ta'an moved to the door, signaling for her to stay behind. There were 6 of them, McKean at the front, rifle in hand. "Step aside, widow," McKean barked. "We've come for the thief." Eliza pushed past Ta'an and stood in the doorway. "He's no thief. You have no proof." McKean's lip curled, proof enough that he's breathing near decent folks. He raised his rifle. The sound of the shot cracked through the morning. Eliza screamed as the bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Ta'an's shoulder. He lunged forward, disarming McKean with a single strike, but one of the men behind him hit Ta'an hard across the head with a rifle butt. He fell to one knee, blood running down his temple. "No!" Eliza snatched McKean's dropped revolver and fired. The shot rang out sharp and final, grazing McKean's arm. The others froze, shocked by her defiance. "Get off my land," she shouted, voice shaking but fierce. "You touch him again, and I swear I'll finish what I started." The men hesitated, then scattered, none willing to die for the sheriff's grudge. McKean cursed, clutching his bleeding arm, then spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Eliza. You chose the wrong side." When they were gone, Eliza dropped the gun and ran to Ta'an. His eyes were half closed, blood matting his hair. She pressed her hands against the wound, tears spilling freely. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please." His voice was faint but steady. "You fought for me. I'd fight the whole town if I had to," she whispered. "You're my husband." His eyes softened and a faint smile touched his lips. "Then maybe I am home." He lost consciousness then, his head falling against her shoulder. And as the sun rose red over the desert, Eliza Hammond, once the quiet widow of Dry Creek, knelt beside the man everyone called Lone Apache and realized she'd risked everything for him, and she would do it again. For 2 days the house smelled of smoke, blood, and herbs. Eliza barely slept, tending to Teon's wound while the desert wind rattled the shutters. Every time he stirred or groaned, her heart leapt, fearing he might not wake again. But he did. On the third morning, when dawn painted the horizon pink, Teon's eyes fluttered open. He looked confused for a moment, then found her face, and everything softened. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice rough. She let out a breath that was half laughter, half sob. "Of course I stayed. You scared the life out of me, Teon." He tried to sit, wincing, and she hurried to steady him. "You took a hard blow. The men are gone. McKean's humiliated but alive. I sent word through the preacher's boy. Most of the town knows what happened by now." "Then they will come again," he said quietly. "Let them," she said, her chin lifting stubbornly. "I'm not hiding anymore." Teon studied her, eyes tracing her face like he was seeing her anew. "You are not the same woman who feared the world. Maybe you're not the same man who hid from it." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a quiet understanding that neither wanted to name yet. Over the next week, Teon healed slowly. Eliza tended the crops, cared for the animals, and cooked by the window so she could watch him rest. But each evening he grew stronger, sitting beside her at the table, speaking a little more each night. He told her about his people, his tribe scattered by soldiers, his mother who'd sung to the stars, his brother who died at his side in battle. "I learned to live with ghosts," he said once, "until I met you." Eliza reached across the table and took his hand. "Then maybe it's time the ghosts rest." For a long moment, they sat in silence, her small hand resting in his scarred one. Then she smiled faintly. "Besides, you said you needed to be loved again. Maybe I need to learn how to love again too." He looked up sharply, as if her words startled him more than a bullet. But she meant it. After her husband's death, she had built walls so high no one could reach her. And yet this man, this wounded, gentle warrior, had climbed them without even trying. That night she dreamed of him, not as the Lone Apache feared by the town, but as the man who watched over her with quiet devotion. When she woke, she found him already outside, repairing the fence in the early light. "Your wound," she began. "Is nothing," he said, glancing over his shoulder with that half-smile she'd come to crave. "Work makes me strong again." "Then you'll be strong by noon," she teased, and he laughed, low, rich, and rare. Days turned into weeks. They planted new crops together. They rebuilt the barn. They even rode into town once, side by side. People stared, but Eliza held her head high. Teon didn't speak, but his presence beside her said everything. She wasn't afraid anymore. One evening, after a long day of work, the two sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the desert. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of sage. Teon spoke softly. "When I was young, my mother said the desert gives two gifts, pain and love. One teaches you who you are. The other teaches you who you could be." Eliza smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And which one am I?" He turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You are both." Silence settled over them, deep and golden. His fingers lingered near her face, tracing the faint freckles on her skin. For a heartbeat, time stood still, only the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the dry grass. "I used to think love was gone from me," she murmured. "That it died with my husband." Teon's thumb brushed her jaw, slow and tender. "Love does not die, Asha," he said softly, using the Apache word for beloved. It hides, waiting for someone brave enough to find it again. Her breath caught. Then maybe you found it first. He smiled, a rare, quiet thing, and kissed her forehead, reverent and unhurried. They didn't speak after that. The world didn't need words. The sky blazed orange, and the stars began to rise, each one a witness to something fragile, reborn. Eliza Hammond, once a lonely widow, and Tyan, the man the town called savage, sat side by side as equals, as something more. Love, real and unbroken, had finally taken root. The peace they found didn't last long. In the desert, nothing golden stays, especially when envy and hatred still smoldered beyond the horizon. For a time, Eliza and Tan lived quietly. They worked the land, shared long evenings by the fire, and even laughed now and then. But deep down, they both knew something was coming. McKean's pride had been burned, not buried. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, Eliza noticed smoke rising far off near the ridge. It wasn't from their land. Tan, she said softly, pointing. He narrowed his eyes. That is not a settler's fire. Then who? Before she could finish, a figure galloped up the path, a young ranch hand from town, his face pale with dust and fear. Mrs. Hammond, Apache raids, they're saying your man's tribe is back, burned 2 homesteads near Dry Creek. Eliza's heart dropped. That's not possible. The boy swallowed hard. Sheriff's calling for a posse. He says your husband's leading 'em. Ta'an's jaw tensed and he stood tall, silent as stone. He lies. I know, she said quickly, placing her hand on his chest. But they won't care. The ranch hand hesitated, eyes darting between them. He's coming here, ma'am. Said he'd finish this once and for all. Then he turned and rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind. Eliza turned to Tan, trembling. We have to run. He shook his head. No. If we run, they will say I am guilty. If I stand, maybe one will see the truth. Her voice broke. They won't see anything but what they want to see. His eyes softened. Then I will make them see. Before she could argue, he was already gathering his weapons, loading his rifle, and tying his long hair back with leather cord. The calm that settled over him was terrifying. That night the fire came closer, not from the hearth but from the hills. McKean and his men arrived like a storm, carrying torches that painted the desert in angry orange light. Eliza stood beside Ta'an on the porch. The night air was thick with smoke and fear. Come out, Apache, McKean shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. We know you called your tribe down from the hills. This ends tonight. Ta'an stepped forward into the torchlight. You burned your own to make war, he said in his deep, steady voice. You bring fire and call it justice. McKean's laugh was cruel. You think anyone's gonna believe you? You'll hang Savage, and the widow? She'll thank me when you're gone. Eliza's fury rose like wildfire. You're the one who'll hang McKean. You've poisoned this town with your hate long enough, McKean sneered. Step aside, woman. I won't. Then burn with him. He hurled his torch toward the barn, and flames erupted instantly, leaping into the dark sky. The horses screamed, the chickens scattered, and the night became chaos. Tan! Eliza cried as he dashed toward the barn, throwing open the doors to free the trapped animals. Smoke swallowed him whole. Without thinking, she followed, wrapping a wet cloth around her mouth. Inside, the heat was unbearable, the flames clawing up the wooden beams. She saw him struggling to pull a frightened mare free of her stall. Go, he shouted over the roar. I'm not leaving you, she screamed back. Together, they shoved the mare out the door, coughing, gasping for air. Then a burning beam fell. Ta'an pushed her aside just in time, taking the blow across his shoulder. He staggered, pain etched into his face. Outside, McKean saw them emerge and raised his rifle. End of the line, Apache! Before he could fire, a shout rang out from the darkness. Stop! It was the preacher's boy with half the town behind him. The townsfolk had come running when they saw the flames from miles away. McKean turned, startled. He's a murderer. The boy pointed at the burning barn. No, he just saved their lives. You're the one who lit it, the crowd murmured, torn between fear and guilt. Anne, bleeding and half-conscious, stared at McKean. Your hate will die with you, not with me. McKean, furious and cornered, lunged, but Eliza fired first. The bullet struck the dirt near his boots, warning, not killing. You're done, Sheriff, she said coldly. By dawn, McKean was in chains, taken by his own deputy. The barn was gone, but the house still stood. And so did they. Eliza sat beside Ta'an, his head resting in her lap, his face streaked with soot and blood. She ran her fingers through his hair and whispered, You saved more than just me tonight. He opened his eyes faintly. No, you saved me. Again. The fire had tested them both, and what survived was no fragile flame. It was love, forged in smoke and defiance, strong enough to face the world. By the time spring returned to Dry Creek, the desert had begun to change, quietly, stubbornly, like hearts learning to heal. The fire had taken much, the barn, the horses, nearly Ta'an's life. But what it couldn't take was what grew between them. And as the ash settled, something unexpected began to bloom. Eliza built again, one fence post, one wall, one breath at a time. The townsfolk who once whispered behind her back now came to help. Ryder lent her a mule, Mrs. Clay brought seeds, and even the preacher's wife came with bread and an apology. Not all of us saw clearly before, the woman said softly. Eliza looked toward Ta'an, who was mending a fence despite the scar on his shoulder. We see clearer now, she replied, and meant it. Ta'an's healing was slow, but every day he regained more of his strength. At night, when the desert wind blew cool and the stars stretched wide, they'd sit together by the fire. Sometimes he told her old Apache stories, tales of the coyote, the wind spirit, and the woman who turned into the moon. Your people's stories, she said one evening, smiling. They always end with someone learning how to love again. He looked at her, eyes deep and gentle. Because love is how the desert lives. Even when there is nothing, something grows. She rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. Then I guess we're part of the desert now. He turned to her, brushing his fingers lightly through her hair. No, he said. The desert is part of us. It was in that quiet under the whisper of the stars that she finally kissed him. It wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that carried every pain they'd endured, every promise left unspoken. And when she drew back, tears glimmered in her eyes. Ta'an, I don't want to hide what we are anymore. You should not, he said. What we are is true. She smiled softly. Then we'll be true, no matter who can't stand it. The next morning, Eliza did something no one in Dry Creek expected. She hitched up her wagon and rode straight into town, with Ta'an beside her. Heads turned, conversation stopped, and the blacksmith nearly dropped his hammer when they stepped down together. Eliza walked straight into the general store, shoulders square, chin high. I'll need lumber, nails, and some paint, she said, as if daring anyone to object. Mr. Clayton hesitated, glancing at Ta'an. Ma'am, you sure about— Yes, she said firmly. My husband and I are rebuilding. The word hung in the air, husband. She hadn't said it out loud before, but saying it now felt right, solid, unbreakable. A long silence followed. Then the preacher's boy, the same one who'd spoken up the night of the fire, said, Good for you, Mrs. Hammond. Someone clapped. Then another, and another. Not everyone approved, of course, but it didn't matter. The truth had already taken root. That spring, rain came early. The ground, long dry and cracked, softened for the first time in years. Grass crept up between the stones. Wildflowers colored the ridge, and the air smelled new. Eliza stood with Ta'an on the porch of their rebuilt barn, watching the desert awaken. She leaned against him, her hand resting over his. Do you believe it? She whispered. After all the fire, the pain, there's still beauty. He nodded slowly. Because pain is the seed. The earth remembers where it has burned and gives back stronger. She looked up at him, her heart full. Then maybe love's the same. Ta'an smiled faintly. Love is the rain after fire. He bent to kiss her again, slow, tender, grounding. And as their lips met, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and wet soil across the land. For the first time since she came to Dry Creek, Eliza felt the world breathing again. No whispers, no shame. Just the two of them, two souls who had weathered every storm and found each other anyway. And in that moment, as the desert bloomed around them, she knew the truth of what he once said. Love does not die. It waits for those brave enough to find it again. By summer, Dry Creek had changed forever. The gossip had quieted. The whispers faded into respect. And the once widowed woman and the man they called Lone Apache were no longer a scandal. They were a story. A legend whispered over campfires and told to children when the stars came out. The fire that nearly destroyed them had, in its strange way, purified everything. From its ashes rose a home stronger than before. A love that no one could deny. Eliza Hammond, now Eliza Tyann, stood on the porch one morning, sunlight touching her hair, her palms resting on the curve of her stomach. She was smiling without realizing it. The wind carried the scent of rain, and with it, the faint sound of Ton's hammer striking wood. He was building a cradle. When he looked up and caught her watching, he grinned, a small shy expression that still melted her heart. "You are staring again," he teased in his low voice. She laughed softly. "I like watching you build things. Makes me feel safe." He came to her then, wiping his hands on a rag. "Safe," he repeated, his voice deep and thoughtful. "That word means something new now. Before you, it was only a sound." She reached up to touch his face. "And now? Now it is a home." The months that followed were filled with quiet joy. The fields flourished under the rare rains. The rebuilt barn stood proud. The animals returned. And the neighbors, those who once turned away, came to trade, talk, and sometimes linger just to watch the strange, beautiful life that had grown between the widow and the warrior. Even the preacher himself visited one Sunday. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, uncertain. "I came to offer a blessing," he said. Ton didn't speak, but he nodded respectfully. Eliza smiled and welcomed the man in, and when the preacher prayed, his voice trembled. Perhaps he'd seen something holy in what they'd built, something no sermon could name. When the baby came that fall, the sky split open with rain. Ton held his son in trembling hands, awe shining in his dark eyes. The child had Eliza's fair skin and Ton's steady gaze. Eliza, weak but radiant, whispered, "He's proof, Ton, that love can cross anything." Ton looked at her, emotion heavy in his throat. "He is the desert's answer," he said softly. "To every fire. To every loss." They named the boy Koya, meaning hope in Ton's tongue. Life settled into rhythm, days of hard work, nights of peace. Sometimes Ta'an rode far into the canyons to trade or meet with the few who remained of his people. Other times he sat on the porch with his son on his lap, teaching him Apache words beneath the endless western sky. Eliza would watch them and feel her heart ache with gratitude. Once she had thought her life was over, buried with her husband, forgotten by God. Now she understood something deeper. Life doesn't end in loss. It begins again in courage. One evening, long after Koya had fallen asleep, Eliza and Tyann sat outside, wrapped in a blanket as the stars burned above. The desert was silent except for the call of a coyote far off in the hills. Eliza spoke quietly. "Do you ever miss it? Your old life? Your people?" He took a long breath. "Every day. But when I look at you, I know they are not gone. You carry their spirit now. Our child carries both worlds." She leaned against him, eyes glistening. "You gave me more than love, Tan. You gave me life again." He smiled, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "And you gave me something I never knew existed. Peace." The stars above shimmered like scattered fire. The air was cool and fragrant with sage. And in that silence, two souls, once lost, once broken, became something whole again. As the night deepened, Eliza whispered, "When I first met you, I thought you were my protector. Now I know you were my answer." Tan's voice was low, reverent. "And you were mine." He pulled her close. And together they watched the horizon fade into starlight, their land, their love, their home bound by something older than words. And when the wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of earth and rain, it seemed to whisper their truth to the open desert. Love does not end with the fire. It begins where the ashes fall. Under the wide, eternal western sky, the Lone Apache was no longer alone, and the woman who needed a husband had found something far greater, a love that would live as long as the desert itself. The end.